Hello everyone, welcome back to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. I am Pojo, and once again, we are going to be talking about the spoilers for the upcoming Eternal Revelations set. We talked about the Valor and Stealth mechanics in our previous videos. There will be a card after that, I hope, if you haven't seen that yet. But also, we're going to be talking today about the remainder of the community spoilers and Twitter spoilers that we have seen. So let's go ahead and jump right into it, because there's still a lot of cards to cover. We'll also try to get to the draft cards that showed up in the draft environment today, so we'll probably be heading into Eternal proper for that. All right, so let's start with a Life for a Life, 4-cost green-purple Argenport card that says sacrifice a unit to play another unit from your Void and give it Void Bound. A solid little option for basically playing back any sort of big card option. If you're playing in, say, a green, red, purple deck, then you're likely to have a lot of sacrificable tokens anyways, but if you're playing just like Dark Wisp Devour type stuff, this is something that allows you to play very, very big stuff for very, very cheap, at a cheaper cost even than the previous cheapest option, which is Grasping at Shadows. So you can play really, really big stuff early with it. That makes it a viable throne card. I think it is something that specifically goes in the sort of big Argenport mill decks where you are trying to play cards out of your Void, specifically those cards being, you know, big cards like Vara or other like ridiculous shenanigans in that front. You can play this card in Expedition. It's super good in those formats. It's a little less strong and limited due to the fact that you're likely going to have to sacrifice something that actually matters to play back another card that is, you know, maybe just as good, but even though you are losing out on some value, and that is something that matters in limited formats, this is still something that allows you to play back your biggest and best unit and get that recursive advantage, which is something that I think is very, very specific to and unique to Eternal, wherein cards tend to gain benefits over time due to the way that they are modified, and since those abilities and bonuses persist across different zones, unlike other card games, this is something where resurrecting abilities and abilities that play units back from your Void tend to be a lot stronger in these scenarios. So this is definitely not a card to discount even in a limited environment, because say if you give a card Killer, or you give a card an Aegis, or you give a card a permanent stat bonus, then it's likely to be a big monster card that you're going to want to be able to bring back at least once. And so a Life for a Life is usually something where you're going to be willing to trade even a smaller unit to get that bigger, better unit back. It's flavorful as heck. It's a great design. It runs the risk of being completely bonkers in Throne, and it's a pretty fun Expedition and draft card. I got not much more to say about it, but a super powerful option, does a lot of cool stuff. Amplify is back in the format, so let's talk about Oren Jailer. 3-cost, 3/3 that says when you attack with exactly 2 units, Oren Jailer gets +1/+1. This is one of the sub-themes of the set. Attacking with exactly 2 units is something that we have seen on previous spoilers, I believe on our first spoiler video, and also it is something that happens on a number of other spoiler cards that we'll be reviewing today. So yeah, I am not a big fan of this sub-theme overall. I think attacking with only 2 units is it's definitely something to count, and choosing the exact 2 units can be really interesting. The sort of like Exalted style mechanic where you are basically sacrificing some of your aggression to get a particular value benefit is really neat, and the card becoming a 4/4 is an okay benefit in a draft environment. This is something where you can get a decent amount of value while leaving some blockers back, and, you know, get generally decent trades, even though it costs you in tempo and in aggressive potential. The card has Amplify 1, play Detain, which Detain is a temporary disadvantage to your opponent. It is a -6, -0 to their attack, so it basically allows you to completely neutralize a board when played later in the game. That makes it a fairly strong limited choice, but because the card does not provide additional value on its play, it's only an okay Expedition option due to the fact that Detain just isn't that strong a combat trick when played at slow spell speeds. If you can give this card the ability to be played fast, then it becomes a little bit more interesting, because ambushing with this option would be really, really strong for a number of different reasons. But overall, this is a card that mostly belongs in a limited strata and can be played in Expedition to take advantage of Amplify Matters decks and, you know, fiddle around with soldiers and Amplify. It is a really cheap Amplify, and cheap Amplify is really important for a lot of different triggers. Triggering a cheap Amplify as early as 3 is still really good. Amplify 1 is just kind of where you want to be if you want to play with Amplify Matters decks, and this is a fine enabler for that, particularly in Amplify Matters draft. I think it's a good choice for those options. All right, Blitzstone. If you haven't guessed, we're going alphabetical. 2 cost, summon, deal 2 damage to an enemy unit. When you play a unit, sacrifice Blitzstone to give it +1 strength and charge this turn. So it's a char on a relic. That's really not bad. There is a card called Ancient Defenses, which is 3 to deal 3, and that is a really serviceable, excellent removal option that has a really, really good benefit overall. Blitzstone is something where you get the damage immediately. You do have to sacrifice Blitzstone, which means that it doesn't really work that well with cards that care about relics, such as, say, the Arcana. Is there Arcana Monitor? Man, I've actually forgotten the name of the card. The 1/1 that turns into a 7/7, the Explorer that turns into a 5/5. Any of those cards that care about having a relic out won't really care about Blitzstone that much because Blitzstone will sacrifice as soon as they are played. But if you care about having stones in your void for reasons such as, say, Drifting Drone, then you get a lot of benefit out of that. So it's a pretty interesting card in that respect, and having relics in your void is potentially something that does matter in this format, so it's really not a terrible choice on that front. You may even be able to do something weird like sacrifice it to Consuming Greed. I don't know if that's going to be an option or not. I'm pretty sure that the Blitzstone should trigger first and you won't be able to use it to the Consuming Greed, but it's possible that there are some like abuse scenarios where you can trigger 2 sacrifice effects simultaneously and get some interesting benefits. That's something we're going to have to learn through playtesting. In any case, summon, deal 2 damage to an enemy unit. That's a really reasonable option, and giving anything charge on the turn that it's played is actually an insanely powerful effect. I think this card could see play in Throne just due to its ability to turn out big units at fast spell speeds. If you're playing just like a sort of mostly removal based deck that wants to slam a card to, say, play the top 2 units of your deck or trigger some sort of amazing onboard ability, you want to play like a Grodov Stranger and draw a card, any of those things that you're just doing on top of playing a bunch of removal, that's a reasonable Throne option. Not only does it give you that minimal char effect, which is going to be fairly handy, it sets up for a later turn where you get some sort of big awesome effect. I think we're going to be playing with Blitzstone quite a bit. It's clearly an awesome card. It's really, really fun in Expedition and Draft, and I think you could play it in Throne just for its ability to give charge at the cheapest cost yet. This is like an Accelerate, but you don't actually have to pay for the Accelerate. You still get something out of it. Accelerate provides you nothing but the charge, whereas Blitzstone is pushing a lot of different other buttons. Namely, it is already functioning as a removal card, so it doesn't necessarily guarantee to your opponent that you're playing the cards that they think you're playing, and then when those cards come out, they can still be a surprise, which is super, super fun. Yeah, really cool design. I'm so excited to play with this card. This is going to be a really, really fun one. Burnished Grenahawk. More Grenadin birds. The Grenadin animal train continues in Bastion. So 3 cost, red, blue, 1/4 with flying, and pay 4 to give Burnished Grenahawk +3 strength this turn. This is a really reasonable stat line on a limited unit. It may not seem like much, but this type of ability has traditionally been very strong in limited environments. Having a flyer that just is super, super tough and also has the ability to get bonuses and spend your power to do a bunch of extra damage is just generally really quite beneficial. This is also a repeatable effect, so you can dump 8 power into it to make it a 7/4, and that becomes relevant very, very quickly when your opponent is at 21 health. You can kill people with a Burnished Grenahawk, and it's a 3-drop. So that's pretty awesome. I think this card is really, really good in a limited environment. In an Expedition environment, it's kind of a good weapons carrier. Skycrag colors, maybe not so much, but it seems okay. I would probably not play it in a Throne environment just because it's, pretty standard flyer. It is a really, really healthy flyer for Skycrag. Skycrag does not typically have 4 health flyers at 3. That is a really surprising stat line. The only other 4 health flyer right now is a Felon card, and it's really not bad. So yeah, pretty neat stuff. Distilled Rage, 2 of your units go berserk at 4 cost. So yeah, this is a really neat effect. I think that this is basically equivalent to like a rally type effect where you get some extra benefits. It could be triggered in addition to like some of your charge effects or other abilities that get you some really, really good benefits, but the generally large cost of the card is somewhat prohibitive in doing like really interesting tricks where you are playing the units and then giving them berserk in the same turn. So you have to have units on board for this card to get its maximum value, and it's a slow spell, which can be responded to with removal. All of that makes it relatively weak in a throne or expedition environment, but the overall like top end of this card is 2 8/8s with really, really good abilities attacking twice, which will tend to be a game ender. So it functions very similar to something like Death from Above, where the benefit from it is really, really strong, but you kind of have to pay so much for it that it may not be worth it. In a draft environment, this seems like a really, really good choice. Like in a limited format, you can just do this to flyers and get a ton of damage out of it, or get a ton of extra effects like the Wretched Raven proc, or like any sort of like attack-based effect. You get extra copies of that. That's really, really fun. You can make cards Berserk to like give them stats for like the hero of the people type thing. There's a lot of like different little triggers and interesting things you can do with a card. However, the cost is, you know, that Death from Above cost combined with no stat growth at all can be a little bit tricky. This still represents a pretty big swing in a limited format, so it definitely would be a trick that I'd carry 1 of. It would probably never be a trick that I'd carry 2 of in any type of limited deck. Bone Mask. 4 cost 2/2 with ultimate when the wielder hits the enemy player. Draw a card for each of your units with 4 strength or more. So yeah, the stat line on this is Healer's Cloak stats, but the effect is pretty immediate and triggers on any flyer that you play it on or any unblocked unit that you play it on. You can play this card when your opponent is skint on power, and then just immediately guarantee that you get the extra card, which will probably be maybe 2 extra cards depending on your situation. Most likely you're using this to upgrade like a flyer while you have a 4/4 on the board. So there's some neat ways to get like a decent amount of extra cards out of the card while also buffing up one of your units, making it a little bit harder to kill. Despite the low stats on this is a really decent weapon. It also triggers the ultimate, and there are not that many ultimate triggers in the draft environment right now for ultimate mandrakes, which it just is something to keep an eye on, because this actually does trigger Marius Mandrake and all of the other mandrakes that care about ultimates. This is something that particularly benefits them, so it's worth keeping an eye on for that reason in both limited and expedition formats. In a draft environment, there are probably better ways to draw cards in time, like you can just draw 2 off like Ancient Lore or something like that and get some stat benefits that way, but it's not an unreasonable choice. It's just a kind of mediocre one overall. Glenn Pathcutter. All right, this one came out smaller somehow. 2/1 with the Shadow Influence ability. You're gonna see this a lot just because like I think there's a lot of this is like sort of a development scar where this is clearly something where you're just trying to make it so that mill decks don't get access to all of these really ridiculous options unless they are actually in the right colors. Ever since Felrauk, was it Felrauk? The Zumic Observer. I can't remember her name either. But like, yeah, basically any of these cards that have these like free void-based effects, there are a lot of different ways where you can like throw stuff into the void and like you get these benefits only if you have the Shadow Influence. But Shadow Influence, when Pathcutter goes to your void, give a unit or weapon in your hand +2 strength. So discard-based synergy is that you can buff your relic weapons. It's kind of okay. In addition, this is a 2/1 that when you attack and like trade with something, which is pretty likely for a 2/1, 2/1s are notoriously death prone. They are just very, very likely to die within the first couple of turns, which means you're fairly likely to get this benefit. Like, it's just always worth it to block the Pathcutter, so it's very likely to actually buff the weapon in your hand, that +2 strength. The question is that +2 strength going to be worth losing the card? And I think in many situations the answer is going to be no. While buffing a relic weapon with, say, high health is really, really beneficial, particularly if that relic weapon has quick draw or, like again, like a high health stat or something along those lines. Typically, this doesn't actually always lead to immediate value, which can be, you know, kind of tricky. It just makes sure that the relic weapon can kill something that it might not otherwise be able to kill. Giving this to a flyer is more beneficial in a limited format, and therefore a very likely reason to play Pathcutters, apart from the fact that you just want to play 2/1s in limited environments for one. So yeah, this is a good aggro option that really pushes the flyers and allows you to open up with relic weapons and flyers to get basically a lot more damage a lot faster. for, but it isn't a super value card. The void ability is mostly only okay, and it's just a nice thing to trigger off of discards. You can do some pretty interesting stuff with it, and if you can figure out ways to force the discard in Shadow, then you can definitely get a very nasty weapon very, very early on. The weapon will still be restricted by whatever your armor value is, so there's a lot of assembly required, but this is an interesting and integral piece of that assembly for an armory style deck. Bottled Insight. Speaking of discard synergies, Bottled Insight draws a card and then has Amplify to draw an additional card, then discard a card. So at its base, at 3, this is draw 2 cards and discard a card. If you draw it at 1, then you're at least cantripping and putting some spells in your void for like Moment of Creation style triggers that are just caring about spells in your void. There's probably not a lot of reason to do that, but playing it for the 3 cost, I think, is your baseline, and that's really not a terrible option. The more you amplify this card, the more you're actually really happy with it. Like, it is all card selection, so sinking more power into the card does not give you more card advantage, but it does give you better card selection, and that is something that I think is really beneficial. In addition, the card triggers Amplifies. It's a common card that triggers Amplifies, and the effect in limited formats is going to be really, really beneficial due to the fact that it's a huge power sink that also gets you to your very best Amplify cards very, very quickly, while buffing up those Maveloft elites and triggering all of your other Amplify Matters cards in very short order. So strong Huru option in limited formats, really good Expedition card. I would say this is even potentially playable in Throne, although it is only an okay draw card in that effect. I think there are plenty of different ways to amplify for maximum amounts of power. There aren't that many that play this cheap. Playing it at 3 or 5 are both like decent options, and you're going to be pretty happy about those draws. If you're playing it at like 7 or 8 or 9, like, you're probably going to want like Brilliant Idea along those or something along those lines, but the flexibility of Bottled Insight is a big part of the card's draw, and I think that's relevant and makes it an interesting and intriguing option for high power formats in addition to Expedition and the limited formats. So, all right, Freight Audrey. This is a 1/4 with Flying Summon. You gain an Aegis. So pretty immediate effect. It gives you the Aegis. There are a lot of ways to do this that are cheaper and tend to be a little bit better. Being a forecast card, you can get it off transpose, so if you just really want to keep forcing that Aegis, that's definitely an option. I don't love this card. Even in like an Expedition format, I am skeptical of the value of gaining a personal Aegis as opposed to the card actually having an Aegis. It is a soldier, so if you're benefiting soldiers in some way, Freight Audrey is a little bit better. Playing this along with the 4-cost card that gives soldiers +1/+1 gives you a 2/5, which is definitely a very good unit to have in a limited environment. I don't see this playing an Expedition just due to the fact that its stat line is terrible and continues to be terrible the more you play it. It doesn't have Aegis itself, so it's still very vulnerable to removal, and like overall the card just doesn't impress me on a number of different levels. In like a draft format, I would play it. There are 1/5s that are playable at 4, and those are like still just kind of okay cards. This card has no ability to put a clock on your opponent. Even if you have air superiority, it's just going to be pinging like once every now and then. It's an okay answer to your opponent's air superiority, but at 4 health, like, it's probably going to get rolled over eventually, and the gaining your personal Aegis is just an effect that you're not really looking for in a limited environment. So I don't really know where this card belongs. I don't really know who it's for. It's possible that personal Aegises are going to be a really important thing in limited, and if that's the case, then my estimation of this card goes up higher, but I don't think you pick this very often. This is one of the worst draft cards that they've showed so far. Inoa's Fury. Get a +2 weapon on one of your units. It gets quick draw this turn. 2 cost to play a weapon, which is a permanent bonus. And also it gets quick draw, which is an excellent effect. This is really strong. So this is similar to the extremely powerful card Rapid Shot, where you get a quick draw effect and a strength bonus on a unit, which almost always leads to the unit on the other side of the fence dying. Combined with Valor being a very common effect, blocking units is going to be a really difficult proposition in red. If you put in a Noah's Fury on even that 2/1 Grenadin that has Valor, this card can trade up to a 5 health unit, and it can do it at 2 cost. That's a really, really powerful effect, and it leaves a permanent +2 weapon on your unit. In addition, it triggers weapon synergy, it triggers spell synergy. Playing 2 different types of cards in general is just really, really good in Eternal because there's a lot of different cards that synergize with different types of things. You still get to keep the weapon, so like that's really beneficial. Like, I think that there's just a lot of good in this card. This is clearly the pushed combat trick of the red persuasion in this format, and it's definitely going to be something that you play in both Expedition and in Draft, and honestly, I think you could play this in Throne. Like, it is a quick draw in red, and red does not really have a quick draw yet. Like, I think having a red equivalent of Rapid Shot makes this quite a possibility for red decks that aren't playing the Shadow for Cabal Tactic or Rapid Shot. It's just a really interesting option that gets you some pretty sweet stuff as a result. So, super, super cool. Hypnotic Valkyrie. Okay, every card is always a different size. There's a Madness, which is steal and ready an enemy unit. Hypnotic Valkyrie is flying 4/4, amplify 2, play Madness. So 5 cost 4/4 flyer. Already you want that in a draft environment. You're super happy to see that. Even in an Expedition, that's not a bad stat line, particularly because the Amplify ability is Madness. And I mean that both literally and metaphorically. It's a good effect to amplify multiple times. Played in a late game board state, this card can steal your opponent's entire board and then attack them with it, which will kill them every time. In a big scary situation where they have a bunch of units and you have a bunch of units and you're all stalled out, this is a game ender, and I think that's a really, really important benefit on a unit that is otherwise reasonably statted and fairly efficient 4/4 flyer. I can see this being a market card in like Throne environments, which is sort of a measure of how strong it is. In Expedition, like, it's clearly pretty good. You got the evasive ability, you have the stat line being just kind of okay for a flyer, and you have the amplify ability being just a huge benefit. So if you're playing like a big sort of heavy ramp deck, this is a really nice unit to play down on 5 to sort of defend yourself and attack and put tempo on your opponent, and it's a great card to play at 11. So yeah, like, the bigger and better it goes, the more ridiculous amounts of damage you do. You disable your opponent's blockers, you add more attackers to your board. This is very likely to be that card that pushes for that last bit of health. Even though it provides no permanent card advantage, it is a card that provides you with a way to end the game, and that is really, really relevant because that is what you really want to do in any format where people have like a limited pool of cards. Hypnotic Valkyrie is a super strong uncommon for the draft environment. This is probably going to be a super high pick for people, and also I think it's just good enough for Expedition and even potentially a market in Throne, although Throne has a lot of different things to do. You'd have to play like a really, really high power deck to make this an option, but if you're playing a deck that like regularly gets up to like 30 power, sometimes you just want to go into your market, grab this card, and play it to steal your opponent's entire board. What fun. Really, really nice. Okay, next up we've got Minister of Obens. Nope, hang on. Okay, we've gone over Iron Priest previously, so let's go to Lava Burst. Deal 6 damage. Lava Burst can't be negated or blocked by Aegis. 6 cost card. Cheap, efficient, deals damage to anything, can't be negated. This is reasonable removal. I think it's pretty good in Expedition, pretty good in Draft, but it's not amazing. Overall, the can't be negated ability is something that you may specifically reach for in a market. It costing 6 is definitely a big restriction on the card. It's not as good as, say, Obliterate in terms of your overall tempo, and Obliterate is going to be a better option like 90-95% of the time. It's very unlikely that Lava Burst is ever going to like outweigh cards like that, but the can't be negated ability is pretty neat, and the card does function as a high-level removal spell that actually hits and kills most things. Nowadays, we are seeing, I would say, a little power creep. There are a lot more cards that are 7/7s at 6, but most of the time this card kills any other card at 6, and that's just a reasonable benefit. I think it's a good draft card. I'm skeptical of it in Expedition, but yeah, definitely a neat little piece of red removal, and red does not often have access to stuff that kills units this big, so it's always nice to see red have that ability. I think it's definitely something that functions as a replacement for Obliterate, which is almost never in Expedition formats, so seems pretty cool on that front. Okay, Minister of Obens is next. Flying, Amplify 4, play Inspire Obedience. This is a little weirder than the Madness one. Notably, it's significantly weaker on a number of different levels, but it is your value card as opposed to the other Valkyries' sort of like end game card. So Inspire Obedience, 7 cost, kill an enemy unit, your units get +1 strength this turn. Notably, if you're playing the Minister of Obeyance, you probably don't have like a lot of units on board to like give the bonus strength to, but like that's kind of like minor compared to the cards like just general ability to remove cards at 8 and remove even more cards at 12. If you can make this Amplify cheaper, this card becomes significantly better. Like, it's really, really good in Stonescar pairings with Dune Painter and stuff like that, because it's one of the more impactful Amplifies, and paying even a 4 Amplify for a card that just straight up kills an enemy unit is relatively difficult to do. There aren't that many Amplifies that actually have an effect that is this important for card value, so you can get some pretty decent bonuses from that. Yeah, other than that, the card is a 2/2 flyer, which is, it's okay in a draft environment. I think you would play this you'd be a little bit more likely to play this in Expedition, probably not likely at all to play it in Throne. There's just too many other ways to sort of one-sided wrath your opponent's board that aren't going to involve playing a 2/2 flyer for 4 and then paying an additional 4 on top of that, so... yeah, paying 8 to get a 2/2 and kill another unit is kinda mediocre by and large. It's an okay thing to do, but you generally want another unit to stick on top of that. I still think it's fine, and it's definitely a pretty good bomb to play at 8 in a draft environment, and having a 2/2 for 4 is just fine in a draft environment. It's not amazing, but at least it gives you something in the air to sort of pressure with. Off-book Officer, double damage, silence an enemy unit, or play a 1/1 Steadfast Deputy. So 2/1 double damage, which aren't that many cards that just have double damage. You can always do some interesting things with that, but the stat line is super weak. The summon ability silences an enemy unit, which is something you want in draft environments in particular, and it has an extra option if you don't have anything to silence, but you're probably going to have something to silence, and if you don't have something to silence, do you want the Steadfast Deputy that bad? 1/1 Steadfast Deputy is just like by and large one of the weaker cards that you can play. It doesn't trade with anything. It rarely gets... It can be Voltroned with weapons, but typically there will always be a better target for weapons. I feel like Steadfast Deputy is generally a trap, just due to the fact that anytime that you have the card out, if you want to put weapons on it, your opponent will eventually be more than happy to pop that Aegis and get some value out of it, because, I mean, trading 2 cards for 2 cards is fine if the card is, like, sort of, like, just set up already, but, like, mostly the Steadfast Deputy just doesn't trade very well, because it has 1 health. It never really plays with weapons very well, so yeah, I don't think this is a super strong option. Double damage and silence together means you have pseudo removal on a unit that actually has some really good potential, but I think this card is probably not even going to be all that good in draft, and I certainly wouldn't play it in Expedition or Throne. Having silence on a unit is good, so I could be wrong. Certainly there are a lot of different options that can do that, but most of them cost 2 or 3 and can deal with a wider variety of cards as a result of that, because they can be played earlier in the game. Way Supplier. Oh, I love this one. 2 cost 1/1, +1 maximum power, summon the top unit of your deck gets killer. What a fun card. So this gives you Initiative of the Sand, but at 2. It's a little more expensive, which is rare. There aren't that many 2-cost cards that do this. There is one that is 2/2. So notably, like, this card is a little easier to kill than those cards, but that summon ability is just going to turn into value for you, because if you're playing Way Supplier, you're likely to be playing big units. And while the risk here is that, say, you summon it and the top unit of your deck is another Way Supplier, even so, This card gives you the ability to interact with terrible enemy cards and also gives you maximum power to ramp to the stuff that you really, really want to play with. Imagine this in a warp deck. It's just so exciting. I really, really like this card. I don't think it's super powerful. Like, it's obviously understated for what it's doing, which I think is correct by a very large margin. If this card were any stronger, then it would be kind of overpowered. As a 1/1, I think this card is just a really interesting way to basically play that risk-reward game where you use units to get maximum power and then also have the risk-reward of using a small unit to get like a different type of reward. So it's an amazing Timmy card. It's a really fun Johnny card. I think that it's just like something where you get to play either like really big scary units with killer, or you get to like just do some interesting shenanigans. It just fits in decks really well. I think it's a good expedition card. It's not as good in like limited formats as it is. Like, Killer on a limited card is still really nice. This is also a strong enabler for Valor, which the more like killer enablers you have for Valor decks, this is definitely going to make Valor a stronger keyword and a little bit more fun to play with. So yeah, overall seems pretty neat. Definitely does some cool stuff, and overall like just a really fun design. Love this card. What a great initiate. I'm so glad that this one was printed. Or will be printed. 3-cost Outmatch. Kill an enemy unit without the highest strength among all units. So you can kill anything as long as it's weaker than something else on the board. Notably, it doesn't have to be weaker than the stuff that you've got. It just has to be weaker than something else on the board. It's okay removal. I think it kills a wide variety of things, but it does have that restriction where it is not going to kill the thing that you want to kill the most. And that is a really rough restriction to have, even in a limited environment, because like if your opponent has a 7/7 and you have an Outmatch, you really just don't have a lot of good options to get rid of that card. However, if you're playing with big units, this card has basically no drawbacks. It's untargetable. It's just free target removal. I think you definitely play Outmatch and try and get as many copies of these in any deck where you are playing cards with high strength. And notably, there are some cards that buff the strength of units, which there's a Shadow one that does that at 1. So there's a good synergistic pairing in the current format to help out this Outmatch option. But you don't play this card cold. You do actually need some other cards to get this going in Limited and in Expedition if you're playing in an Expedition. It's not a throne card by any means. All right. Next up, we got Cyber Skimmer. Oh wait, nope. We got Overthrow. Kill an enemy unit or site with cost 4 or more at 4 cost. So big thing that kills other big things. Fairly expensive card, but it is a fast card. Sites usually cost 4 or more. There are a couple of cheap sites that you'd probably like to have answers to, but this is fine. It's an okay Death Strike option in green. I am still not a fan of green getting like these weird removal cards that are basically like pseudo shadow removal, but by and large having site answers is just a really nice thing to have, and I'm glad that green has an option to deal with cards like the Speaking Circle, which are continually a bane on everyone's existence. Certainly sites are scary, and you should have good answers to sites. I think this card sees play in most formats. It's definitely stronger in like Expedition or Draft stuff. In Draft, I think you're just super happy to have it because you're going to be able to kill anything that your opponent plays that you really actually want to kill. Okay, next up we got Awakened Instigator. 3-cost 2/2. When you attack with exactly 2 units, Awakened Instigator gets +3 strength. So, another one of those attack with exactly 2 units options. It gets a permanent benefit when you attack with exactly 2 units. So if this is the card that you're attacking with, it's not a bad choice. Notably, say you play a 2-drop 2/2, a 3-drop Awakened Instigator, you attack with exactly 2 units. Now you have a 5/2 attacking, and what's your combat trick? It's a +2 weapon with Quick Draw. That's pretty good. Also, notably, this card has the Awakened subtype, which is something that matters a little bit now. There are a couple of cards that specifically reference Awakened cards. I think it was like the Speaking Circle and a green card, so it's possible we'll see some more Awakened references in the future because Awakened cards are finally starting to awake. We saw this in the lore. This card is basically just a sleeper agent type thing where they're trying to destroy the Bastion for reasons that are still not totally clear, but coming to light as time goes on. So neat little lore card, and also like a really neat aggressive red card that plays really well with Valor and plays really well with other red aggression in both limited and expedition formats. I think this is a really good option with that new combat trick. Cyber Skimmer, flying 1/1, pay 2 and sacrifices to draw 2 cards if you've attacked with exactly 2 units this turn. I don't love this card. So at its best, it's a slow speed Wisdom of the Elders after you have done a particular thing. Generally, when I was looking at the exactly 2 units this turn, I didn't love the design of it, and Cyber Skimmer was a big reason why. This card forces you to do something that you may not want to do in order to get a benefit that is basically equivalent to paying for a 3-cost card. If you had Wisdom of the Elders, you would always play Wisdom of the Elders over this. It is not a throne card by any means. If you're playing with like a 1/1 flyer, like the benefit is that you deal some extra damage, but it's a 1/1 flyer, so it doesn't give you clock or tempo or anything like that. And if you risk something to get the Cyber Skimmer to draw the 2 cards, and then you lose the Cyber Skimmer, then you feel real bad. Like, say it's something along the lines of you play a Cyber Skimmer on 1, you play that 2/2 unit, you attack with both of those units, your opponent blocks the 2/2 because they just have a bigger unit and all you wanted to do was draw the cards, and then before you get to pay that 2 ability, they shoot it with a char. That's a real feel bad, and that's like the worst case scenario on Cyber Skimmer. The best case scenario on Cyber Skimmer is that you deal 1 damage and you draw 2 cards. I'm not in love with it. It's very, very hard to attack with 2 units in other ways without actually paying for like other stuff. So the benefit of paying 2 early to draw the 2 cards is not really a thing. Like, you don't actually get to do great things with that. This card could be okay in like Granite and Sacrifice decks. Like, it is card advantage, and that's like potentially a thing, but there's so many hoops to jump through, and like the hoops include attacking with exactly 2 units and having the Cyber Skimmer live, and I think that like that's too much to ask for the benefit that it's trying to give you. I don't think it's a good card. I don't even think it's a good design. I think it's just super rough, but potentially people will play with it because they want value. All right. Next up, we got... I'll tell you what, if you didn't sacrifice Cyber Skimmer, well, that card would be much, much better. You'd probably have to pay 3 for it. All right, Sanguine Reaper. 3/3 flying charge quick draw. When Sanguine Reaper attacks, each player with a relic draws a card and takes 2 damage. This is a really good card. Got a ton of things that you want in Expedition or Draft. It is aggressive. It deals probably 5 damage on the turn it's played, because if your opponent has a relic, they take 2 damage. If you have a relic, you take 2 damage, but you get to draw a card, which is like best case scenario, right? Because you get to play this card, draw a new card because you have a relic, and then you have a card draw engine that admittedly is damaging you, but you're damaging your opponent with flying quick draw cards. So feels pretty good to attack with, by and large. If you're not attacking with it, it's like a 3/3 flyer in the air, and it's not very good, but you're attacking with it because you're a Stonescar deck, and you're super happy to attack with it in pretty much any scenario. The current like quick draw combat trick still works with it. It at least gives it an extra 2 attack, which is kind of nice. And if your opponent has relics, they're taking a bunch of damage. Well, you are like, they're getting some cards in return for it, but I think paying 4 for 5 damage to their face is generally going to be pretty strong, even if they're drawing cards off of that effect. Yeah, you want to play this card. It's super aggressive. It's super fun. You'd play it in Expedition. You'd play it in Draft. You would only not play it in Throne if the format was particularly relic heavy and you thought that like dealing the damage was not going to be as important as giving them the card. So there are certain meta matchups where them drawing the card is actually going to be really good for them, and they might be able to like regain the health while also keeping the card advantage. But most of the time, decks that are playing relics do not want to take that much damage, and taking 5 is a big deal, while you taking 2 to draw a card is not. So yeah, super, super cool. Recycle. 2-cost, sack a unit or relic to play 3/1/1 Grenadin. It is a cheaper assembly line that only requires you to sack a unit. This card's really good. You are happy to sacrifice a number of different units, so that isn't even a drawback in some situations, and you get 3 Grenadin as a blocker, and you can do it at fast spell speed as a combat trick. So you can either block with the unit that you're going to sacrifice, get a bunch of Grenadin to sacrifice for something else, or you can sacrifice a unit, get the Grenadin, and use them to block and kill a large number of attacking units. There's a lot of flexibility in this card, there's a lot of versatility in this card, there's a lot of power in this card. You would play it in any of the formats, particularly Throne, because Throne wants to play with sacrifice effects for Shrine to Carve It, which is still a card for reasons. Overall, it's definitely a really, really good option. Well, we're gonna finish this out. Yeah, I was thinking we were halfway down the list, but we still have the draft cards to go. So sorry, this is a long one. We're definitely reviewing a lot of cards here. Relic Feaster, 1/1, amplify, sacrifice a relic to give Relic Feaster +2/+2. Entomb, play a Shadow Sea Slime with strength and health equal to Relic Feaster's strength. A lot of good benefits here. First off, you can play the card and then sacrifice the relic to get a 3/3 that also plays another 3/3 on Entomb. That is pretty good if the first thing that you're playing is like an Emerald Overcharger or something along those lines where you're probably going to sacrifice it anyways, or if it's some kind of card that like when it's sacrificed it gets some benefit, or if it's some kind of card that just gives you like an instant effect, say like the 2/1 for 2, or you know, like even like in a Cass's Audience where you're playing it just to plunder, Relic Feaster's pretty happy to eat that and get a decent benefit. This gives you a lot of aggression because it gives you a pretty aggressive damaging unit that also allows you to be sticky. Basically, if somebody kills this in order to keep from taking damage, they still have to contend with yet another card that has a similar amount of value. I think that this is overall a pretty decent price to pay. You obviously do have to play it in a deck that really has relics that are worthy of sacrifice, so as a draft rare, this is something that you might pick in the first pack and try to build around. It is not a card that you would pick in a later pack as a value option. It is reasonably strong, but very conditional. But yeah, you play this in Expedition because it's reasonably aggressive and there's some cool like Relic Feaster based aggro options that you can fiddle around with. I don't know if you can I would say this card goes up significantly in my estimation based on whether or not you can sacrifice the 2-cost card that sacrifices itself to give something charge. If those effects trigger simultaneously, then Relic Feaster becomes ridiculous. I'm guessing that they don't, but nonetheless, it's kind of an interesting option, and the Amplify ability can get you some really good benefits with relics that you are no longer using or no longer have a use for. So seems like a really cool option. I'd say the 3/3 version of this is probably the thing that you're playing like 90% of the time, but the 5/5 or 7/7 or whatever could be interesting in a situation where you just have to get rid of all your relics or want to get rid of all your relics. So kind of an interesting choice. It would be cool if you could like eat your own curses and stuff, but that's true of a lot of sacrifice or relic effects. Okay, Rule the Skies. Deal 2 damage to an enemy unit. If it has flying, deal 6 damage to it instead. Ooh. 3-cost, Violent Gust, except it kills even bigger units than Violent Gust does, such as Dicro Vindicated, and it kills small units at bad tempo cost. You don't love playing this on a small unit. Like, if you want to kill like some opponent's 1/1 with it, then so be it. It's not a bad way to get rid of like a core tap maximizer or any other like unit that's on the board that just is really bothering you. But I think that this card's power against flying units is super strong, and the fact that it has that extra versatility really pushes it over the edge. I'd play this card in Expedition. I think it's a very strong limited card that you can play in the main board without having to go to the market, and I'm always looking for options along those lines. Generally, there are a lot of flyers in Expedition that are worth dealing with, and being able to kill small units is something that you're willing to pay the extra power for, even if you don't find any flyers to attack. Tower Inspector, 2/1 with +2/+2 if you have played a unit this turn, +2/+2 if you've played a relic this turn. Okay, that's a strong one. So here's the ideal, right? Tower Inspector is a 2-cost 2/1, so you play that on 2. And then on 3, you play Relay Point, get a 2/1 soldier, and you have a 6/5 attacker on 3. That's a really aggressive and ridiculous option. And notably, it still leaves you with the Tower Inspector probably for the next turn, since it's going to be an aggressive option that will trade with something, stay alive for longer. That means you have more units on the board to actually exhaust the Relay Point later and play Sentinels. There are plenty of other options that are going to make this type of stuff really, really strong, and Sentinel Relics are going to be a much stronger deck for having Tower Inspector. This is a really good Expedition card. It is a really good draft card. I think it passes muster in Throne for certain types of aggro, but it depends on really how good Sentinels are in Throne. I'm not particularly familiar with that type of deck in Throne. It's just okay on that front. There are a lot of interesting ways to do aggro in that setup. So, okay, Spear Dancer, flying at the end of your turn. If another of flying, 3-cost 1/1, notably. At the end of your turn, if another of your units hits the enemy player, it gets a straight up +1/+1 bonus. So you can play this card, attack with 2 other units that you have played on 1 and 2, and then make it into a 3/3 bird, which it's a soldier bird too, so not a bad benefit. This card works really well with all of those Grenadin that you're going to be playing off the new cheaper assembly line. It works really well with other flyers. It works really well with anything that's got Overwhelm, and by and large it's just a really strong limited card to be playing down, because the card, as long as it's not getting removed immediately before the end of your turn, allows you to do some pretty sweet stuff pretty quickly. The one thing I would say is interesting about it, and would have to be checked, is how it interacts with units that have attacked before Spear Dancer is played, because I believe the correct way to do this is to attack with a number of different units. Oh, never mind. I did miss that says if another of your units hit the enemy player, it gets +1/+1, but it's not a condition. It's a conditional based on just one of your units hitting the enemy player. You don't get it multiple times. So that does actually reduce my estimation of the card a lot due to the fact that it only grows once per turn. However, you can still play this as a 2/2 flyer on turn 3, because if another of your units hits the enemy player, you play Spear Dancer, and then it immediately grows, I believe without your opponent getting the opportunity to respond to it, because it affects itself, so it doesn't affect your opponent or trigger a fast spell option. So if you play it in your main phase 2, due to the way that Eternal works, you play it, end your turn, and your opponent does not get a window at that point to affect the card before it becomes a 2/2. Still, it's a 2/2. It's probably still going to be killable by most forms of removal at that point. And a flyer that grows while being extremely good in draft environments is not necessarily going to be good at that cost in Expedition or Throne. If this card grew for each unit that hit, it would be very powerful, particularly in Limited. As it stands, it's just an okay limited option that definitely does some pretty neat stuff. Ransack. Discard a card to draw the top 2 cards of the enemy player's deck. More of this like sort of sacrifice to do other cool things going on, and another really cheap and interesting effect. So the equivalent of this is like Pilfer for 1, which this is a much better card than Pilfer for a number of different reasons. One, it actually does allow you to get well, it doesn't allow you to get card advantage, notably. It also means you're discarding a card that you want to get 2 cards that you don't know that you want, because you're drawing off of your opponent's deck. And Pilfer is not a card that you would play either. But because discarding a card is so frequently not a downside, this card very frequently represents 2 cards worth of value without the cost of the card that you are discarding, because maybe you're discarding the card to trigger the 2/1 that like gives one of your relic weapons a +2 strength. Maybe you're discarding the card because it's an echo card in Throne. There's a lot of different ways that Ransack becomes a super playable option, and I think you can find those ways in the current draft environment. There's clearly cards that actually play with it. It's good in Expedition because drawing 2 cards and triggering a discard effect is just generally going to be strong there. And in Throne, you have so many different ways to play with Ransack. There's so many different Fate and Echo and Discard Matters cards to fiddle around with. This is clearly going to be a strong choice that actually gives you access to your opponent's powerful cards and cards outside of your own color, as well as cards that are often designed to sort of like counter the enemy deck. It's not always a truism, but decks tend to counter themselves sometimes, or at least have cards that counter themselves, and that happens a pretty frequent amount of the time. So cards like Ransack are reasonable at doing the stuff that you want to do on that front, which is really, really nice. And by and large, just card advantage if you can get some kind of benefit off the discard. Boiling Geyser, deal 3 damage to an enemy unit that was played this turn. Still my least favorite, like, sort of repeating design in Primal. This is a card that has been printed multiple times and has not been good any of the times that it's been printed. When it was crashing Avalanche with Warp at 3, it was pretty bad. Here it's at 1, and it is Torch speed. It just kills stuff the turn that they're played. So this is about as powerful as you can print this card and still have it be good, and I'm still not sure that it's good. It's hard to evaluate. I would say that, like, killing a unit for 1 is usually tempo efficient, but holding up 1 power is almost always not. So this is definitely a removal card to watch out for, and a removal card to play around under certain circumstances, and even a removal card to pick and draft. It's just no fun to play in Limited or Throne. I mean, it might be powerful in Limited because it is capable of removing things, but there's a reason people didn't play Crashing Avalanche too, which is just that holding up power to wait for a unit that doesn't come is just a really miserable experience, and it's really bad to, like, play a unit and get hit by one of these too. It just doesn't feel great on either side. I don't like these designs. I'm not a big fan of these cards, and I hope that Boiling Geyser isn't powerful, because maybe then they'll stop printing Boiling Geyser. Alright. Unchecked Upgrader. When one of your units hits the enemy player, it gets +1 strength. Decent effect on a 4-cost card. This was an okay relic in draft environments, so it's going to be an okay unit in draft environments, and I think it's better as a unit than it is as a relic for most of the reasons that units with these effects are typically better than relics. Depending on the power of the card, sometimes you want it on a relic to be basically harder to kill. In this case, this is an effect that you're fine with your opponent killing to make sure it doesn't happen, because they're not targeting your other units, which are the ones that are growing. This is a reasonable card to play before an attack, and a pretty good draft or expedition card. It's not powerful enough for Throne by any means, but it's definitely cool. Avara Dark Summoner, and we're almost at the end. We'll have to review the draft cards separately because this has already stretched to almost an hour. 2 cost 2/1. Your units cost 2 less. When you play another unit, the enemy player plays a -2, -1 curse on it, so an affliction. So yeah, this is a really good effect. I would say that because this ability allows you to play other things very, very cheaply, you can play Initiative Sands into Avara into, let's see, 2, 3, a 6 cost on 3. Yeah, so decent effect. You do have to play a -2, -1 curse on it, which is not always great. You can potentially remove that curse later with some other effect. Because I am me, my brain immediately goes to Krill, Merciless Pillager, and playing like a yellow, purple, red, blue deck that wants to do that. There are much better things that you can do with Avara Dark Summoner. Notably, the fact that you can just play really expensive and scary effects, even if the unit is reduced as a result of that, is just really, really strong. Like, if you're playing a Grodov Stranger on 4, you're really not that unhappy about the Grodov Stranger being a 4/5. That's just not that big a deal. If you're playing the Grodov Stranger for 2 off of 2 Avara Dark Summoners, are you really that sad that it's a 2/4? Probably not. So yeah, this is a card that can definitely see play in any of the formats and is strong in all of them. It is actually weaker in Limited than in the other formats because playing afflictions on your units is going to be generally less strong, and because you can't multiply Avara Dark Summoner, it's a rare, you just can't play that many of them. You're probably not going to be drafting all high cost cards and Avara in order to get those high cost cards out, because you can't guarantee you'll draw Avara. In any other format, this card is like a really interesting and strong option that gives you some really, really cool benefits and creates curses for you to fiddle around with if you have the ability to destroy them in some other fashion. So cool stuff, definitely does some interesting shenanigans, and overall clearly leads into some really, really fun options. All right, Mod Ready Drone. It's a 3-cost 2/2. Summon, play a light plating with flying or a +1/+1 sidearm on Mod Ready Drone. I don't believe light plating is listed on the left side, so we'll have to figure out what that card is. I'm guessing it is a weapon, and it's probably just a weapon that is a 0/0 flying. I believe actually that I've seen the spoiler for this, and it is in fact a 0/0 flying. So a 0/0 flying weapon or a +1/+1 sidearm. That's what we're going with anyways. I could be wrong. If I am, I'm sure I'll be corrected in the comments. So this is either a 2/2 flyer or a +1/+1, a 3/3 without flying. As a 3/3 for 3, it's a pretty efficient weapon, a unit. As a 2/2 for 3, it's a modestly efficient but not amazing flying sentinel. Plays weapons on itself really well. Notably, the fact that this card is both a unit and a weapon means that it triggers the 2-cost card that we were previously talking about, which cares about whenever you play a unit or a attachment. Now that might be unit or relic. Yeah, I think that might be unit or relic. So wouldn't trigger that, but any type of like muster type effect where you need to get like an extra weapon and a unit down at the same time, or you just want to count your weapons and have something that actually creates weapons for these types of abilities, that's an interesting side benefit that is something that shouldn't be undervalued. The card's reasonably strong in a limited format, and for the reason of creating those weapons for later use, could potentially be of interest in Expedition or Throne options. I think Throne probably doesn't want to play with it, but you never know. Valkyrie Station, 3 cost. At the end of your turn, play a 2/2 Valkyrie with Flying if you have 7 armor or more. Otherwise, gain 1 armor. This is a really cool effect. One of the more interesting value engines that Green has printed, not only because it creates interesting units, which is something that I actually really like. In Justice value engines, most Justice value engines only produce blank cards with even stats. This gives you a Valkyrie and also cares about something weird, which is armor. The armor is interesting for setting up relic weapons and armory type stuff, and if you don't get the armory type stuff, you still get the ability to potentially play Valkyries with Flying. Stalling out the board with this is really fun in draft and will win you the game because the Valkyrie will eventually overwhelm your opponent, but you have to make sure that you have 7 armor or more, which is not an easy requirement to fulfill even when you're gaining 1 armor every turn. However, if you play this card early, you are gaining enough armor overall to make this card worth it in a limited format or in an expedition format. It is expensive, so that is the one thing I will say about it. It is an expensive card that technically only gains life, and that is something that should be viewed with a little bit of skepticism because cards that only gain life are typically not amazing. However, it gains armor instead of life, which is much more valuable for relic weapon based sets. I would say that you would play this in a deck that plays relic weapons, even though playing with relic weapons means you are less likely to trigger the Valkyries, because the constant armor gain is going to be a huge benefit for you, and the Valkyries are just a bonus if all of your relics somehow get destroyed by other means. So it's a super strong option for that. In other formats, I think it's a little bit less likely to be relevant, but it seems like a really interesting draft card and a really fun green engine to play with. So I'm excited about this one. And another nice little relic to trigger relic and sentinel synergies. So cool stuff on that front. Okay, that is the end of the community spoilers for now. We were going to go to the draft spoilers. We're going to have to do those in another video because this is just under an hour. So we're going to call it here. We will be back with another video discussing all of the draft spoilers, and we will show that off, I believe, tomorrow. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Feel free to like or subscribe if you like the video, and we're interested in more of our takes on different cards, as well as more crazy brews when the set comes out, which again, May 18th. Until then, see you next time. Cheers!